supervised event, someone's oversight it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so he's failed to do it. No one's oversighted it.
Yeah.
So he's unrelated to 2 and 1, except that 2 ought to have had an audit within the organisation to have identified those 2 things.
He should have planned those flights.
Just hear my question. So we
he
don't watch
being
the
number
sun
one.
come up
Number
here.
2.
Number 2, what Mr. Campbell's saying.
Number 3, insofar as number 1 had nothing to do with number 3. I'm not trying to do the butler in the lounge room with the candlestick, but number 1 had nothing to do with number 3. Number 2's failure was, in this global failure, he had a manual, he was responsible to see that everyone was properly checked and tested, and in the case of number 3, he did not. So,
Well, firstly, 2 things. He did not. So he is supposed to plan the flights and make sure they occur, and make sure the regime actually works and all of their pilots are checked.
Yes.
And secondly, the number 3 himself did not assure he was qualified.
No, I accept that. Righto, number 4.
Number 4, number 4 was the last operational proficiency check was conducted on the 29th of June by person number 1, when person number 1 wasn't authorised to conduct the check.
We'll call that a number 1 event. Is there anything else from that particular pilot?
No, I don't think so.
Have you got any women in here? I'd like to share this around a bit. Or they're all men. Okay. Number 5.
Number 5. Number 5 had done an OPC and an IPC on the 9th of November 2017, but it appears, had not complied with the previous checks. So he'd done one. So in other words, he hadn't done them in the 12 months, but he'd actually done something recently in 2017, and he was the one that ultimately, if I may, was the least egregious, who I allowed to fly later on.
Yes, but let's just deal with this. And Senator Patrick, you jump in.
No, you're doing a great forensic job there, Chair.
The 9th of the 11th, 17, he done something which would have brought him into time. His crimes were historical before that.
Yep.
Yes.
And to what extent were they historical? He failed to do a second OPC in the year of 17 at all.
IPC.
IPC, is it?
I haven't got the details.
2 checks, an IPC and an OPC.
Mr. Campbell might know.
My understanding is that the checks were done the second check was done about 9 days late, give or take. So it was relatively close to the due date. That's what allowed the exemption to take place.
Yeah, but, okay, so, and we'll come back to this, and I'm sure Senator Patrick, but his crime is he done what he was supposed to do at particular intervals within a calendar year, but the second one was 9 days late. That's his crime?
I believe so.
Okay. Number 6?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Number 6 and number 7, because they're both pretty much the same. Both undertook line checks with number 1, 2, 3, 4, number 5. When he had not undertaken timely and valid proficiency checks.
Yeah, the 9-day thing.
Yep.
Right.
There was another one as well.
There was another one.
It was the co-pilot on the Falcon 2000.
So,
there is one more too, which isn't in my list.
Yeah, the chief pilot, which is pilot number 2, his co-pilot on the Falcon 2000 had not completed an operator proficiency check at all.
He was a co-pilot?
Yes.
So he'd not completed an OPC at all?
At all with the company, and he had not completed his emergency procedures training. That's about evacuating the aircraft and oxygen requirements, that sort of stuff. So
and how long was he out of date for that? Had he done one? One assumes that
he'd never done that.
He would have done them previously.
No, he'd never done it.
Never in his life?
Never in the company.
Never in the company, only history through.
Never in his life in the company had he done either. Well, what is the OPC? Just break that down for me. It's
Operator's proficiency check.
Do you want to explain? No.
So there's the 2 checks. We talked about an operator proficiency check, and it's a series of circuits and approaches with emergencies thrown in, so a flying check. And this other check he hadn't done was a 2011 emergency procedures check. And 2011 is a civil aviation order, and it's about evacuating an aircraft, loss of oxygen pressure, things of that nature.
All right. So do we think for the purposes of Senator Patrick's examination, I think we've covered the misdemeanors?
You've got a
Okay.
pretty fair indication.
Yeah.
So pilot number one, he's the check pilot, just to clarify that, yeah? Okay.
No.
One of
No, he's not the chief
One
pilot.
of three check
Two's
pilots.
the
Had
chief
multiple check
pilot.
Two's the
pilots.
chief pilot.
Yeah,
No,
okay.
2 is the chief pilot.
Yeah, okay. So you've decided that this is an unacceptable situation, that you think it's dangerous and these people shouldn't fly.
Yep.
Mr. Campbell, on the 8th of December, did you fly with any of these pilots?
On the 8th of December was the Dominic James flight to lift the conditions off his air transport pilot licence
Yep.
that were invoked after the Norfolk accident.
And who was the pilot in command?
The pilot in command for that was David Grant, the Czech pilot,
Which is
was
number one. So despite the fact that it's too dangerous for these guys to fly, you allowed one of your staff to go, in fact 2 of your staff, I believe, to go flying with these people. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I don't,
It was a private flight, Senator. We had, and we can discuss the difference between the two, but we were confident that we could manage that flight. That flight had been planned.
Yes.
hang on, the CASA people on board are not pilots, so they can't assist if something goes wrong in the aircraft.
I was in the rear of the aircraft. We had a qualified Falcon 20 pilot in the jump seat supervising, so monitoring.
Yeah, that was pilot number one.
No, that's Greg Worthington.
It was one of our staff.
And
was in the
he's
jump
qualified and all.
Qualified
He's
and-
done all of the checks, the OPC, the IPC.
He's done the IPCs, but he's not within that company, so he doesn't do an operator proficiency check.
So he wouldn't have been legitimate to fly either. He had the same status as number one.
No, he's
So-
legitimate to fly.
Completely
He's
qualified.
completely qualified, Chair. He didn't. He's got.
Sorry. One. Again, I'm interfering in your line. I should leave it. You'll go.
completely qualified.
No, well, I think you're asking the question I want to ask. So please.
Perhaps,
So,
And he wasn't in the control.
but he hadn't had his proficiency check in an aircraft of that particular company.
No, but he had of that particular type.
No, but the distinction was made before when it was asserted and not disputed that number one had done that too in another company, but it doesn't count.
Correct.
So the fellow in the jump seat, in the co-pilot seat, wouldn't have traditionally qualified to fly that aircraft.
He would in a private situation. The operator proficiency check
I'll tell you what,
specifically
fellas,
details...
let me tell you this. We get a bit excited here from time to time. If your defence around this is some split hair between it's a private flight and a commercial flight, that doesn't wash with me, right? I'll be upfront with you. That's a bloody...
can I perhaps try and answer that?
1 cent either way on the... No, we'll come back to Mr. Crawford.
It is.
I just want to clarify this. In the jump seat, in the co-pilot seat. So you're telling me there are different standards for private flights. So
If I could explain...
Of course, that would help.
So with an operator proficiency check, one of the key points is crew coordination, where you've got specific company procedures that are different from company to company.
Yes.
So an interaction between the flying pilot and non-flying pilot in normal
Yes.
situations is coordinated, rehearsed and documented.
Yes.
In an emergency, it's coordinated, rehearsed and documented.
Yes.
So it's a drill. They don't have to think about it.
Yes.
That's what part of the operator proficiency check
Yep.
is. And an operator proficiency check also includes an element of training. And that
Yes.
training brings people's proficiency back up to standard prior to their check.
Yes,
I
I appreciate that.
In
But
the
your fellow wouldn't qualified under number one.
He wasn't qualified in that organisation, but he wasn't in a control seat. He was in the jump seat. So he's sitting behind the 2 crew and in a situation where if he's familiar with their procedures because he's the oversighting inspector.
Mr. Campbell, I'm sure you've heard the old nursery rhyme about having a cake and eating it too. You've got to choose here. So if your defence to Senator Patrick's line of questioning is that we had a pilot in the right-hand seat who didn't qualify to fly that aircraft, and we had a pilot in the left-hand seat who didn't qualify to fly the aircraft, in a technical sense. They both would seem to be competent pilots of type. I'm looking for, and I think Senator Patrick was looking for, the distinction between those circumstances. Now, all I've heard is
there
private
are
flight versus-
distinctions
There are
between
distinctions.
private and passenger-carrying flights,
They're
and the
clear.
standards are different. And the idea is that what might seem like a technical, being picayune in a technical sense, is how can we conduct this check flight in a way that doesn't conflict with the technical requirements of the law? And conducting it as a private flight didn't invoke those higher requirements. Now, one can argue philosophically whether there should be different levels of safety, but that's the norm in every single country, Senator. So this is not making fine distinctions for the sake of having one's cake and eating it. It was a fact of the situation. And it was a relevant consideration at the time, and it's a perfectly typical way in which these kinds of checks are conducted everywhere in the world, where you'll have the pilot from the regulatory authority sitting in a jump seat, who certainly won't be qualified to fly a revenue flight for that company because he's not checked to those standards and he doesn't operate within that environment, but is capable of making judgments about whether the flight being conducted meets the applicable standards. This is the way it's done.
I think